All right, we here. Urban Artificial Intelligence, Strategic Thinking Media Platform. We're gonna jump right into it, man. Y'all see the title. Y'all already know what we about to get into now. This is not me beating a dead horse. We understand what happened with Rory and Mal and the Joe Budden podcast. Um, So I'm not going to be too extensive on the history of things. We will run through it real quick with Copilot just to create a foundation, as we always do on the show. But the reason that I'm bringing it up now is because there was some recent talk about it on Spaces. Now, before we get into this deep dive, I do want to say I'm a fan of both podcasts. I'm a fan of both podcasts. Um, I stopped watching for a minute. Um, not because not just because Rory and Mal left, but the quality of the Joe Budden podcast did dip a little bit. You know what I'm saying? In my personal opinion, I really honestly thought that this could have been the greatest hip hop podcast of all time. All right. And this live is not gonna be too long. I'm probably gonna be here for about 45 minutes. Um, so I don't want to do too much, but for me, the gold standard of urban hip hop culture, whatever you want to call it, the gold standard of that was the Joe Budden podcast with Rory and Mal. All right. For me, and what I like and my listening, it didn't get any better than that. I still haven't heard a podcast that good. You know what I'm saying? That's why I talk about it a lot. That's why I still feel like it's questions. Not a whole lot of questions still left, but there are still questions because the Joe Budden podcast with Rory and Mal was, and like I say, in my opinion, was going to be the greatest hip hop podcast of all time ever. Some of the episodes, um, every second of this shit is entertaining. And now, how podcasts are is not a whole lot of that right now. It's a lot of people who are doing podcasts just to do it. It's a lot of people who they want the look. You know what I'm saying? They want to say they're podcasters. They kind of don't really take it seriously, and they're carbon copies of the Joe Budden pod, not carbon copies, but they try to imitate the Joe Budden podcast. And they're not really. It's not organic. Um, it's not organic. You know what I'm saying? It's kind of just put together. Um, Rory and Mal and Joe Budden and Parks, they kind of made podcasting cool to an extent. They almost made it like how rappers are, like how everybody wanted to be a rapper. That's kind of what Joe Budden and Rory and Marlon Parks brought to the podcast scene. You know what? I'm gonna say it this way. They did it so effortlessly, and they were funny and entertaining so effortlessly that everybody thought they could do it. When you listen to the Joe Budden podcast with Rory and Mal, it seemed like something that you could do. So that's where we have all this influx of guys sitting around with their friends on a podcast. You know what I'm saying? This is where that came from. This is why there are so many podcasts. And I'm just saying that to say I feel like they set a standard. I feel like they set a standard that is going to be impossible to live up to. All right, it's going to be impossible to live up to. But I'm saying that just to say the high expectations that I set or that were set with this podcast. I don't think Rory and Mal's podcast is as good as the original Joe Budden podcast. I think they're coming into their own you know what I'm saying, as a podcast, but they have a ways to go. And it's unfortunate because they helped build the Joe Budden podcast. And a lot of people don't really realize that. They don't really realize that. It's easy to say, because it's called the Joe Budden podcast. It's easy to say Joe Budden has the hot podcast, Queens Flip, Ice, Ish, Melissa Ford, Imani. And we like them. It's nothing wrong with those people, but the numbers that Joe Budden have, the amount of subscribers, the amount of views that he consistently get, it's, I feel, because people are waiting for the podcast. They're sticking it out and they're hanging in there with him, but they're really just waiting for it to get back to what it was. You know what I'm saying? They're waiting for the quality to get back to what it was with Rory and Mal. And I don't know if that'll ever happen either, but like I say, I'm a fan of both shows. You know, I don't watch them as much as I used to. But I'm getting more back into it. I'm even thinking about joining both of their Patreons because it's just a good, it's gonna help me make content, number one. But number two, I want to follow closely where this goes. I want to follow closely where the Joe Budden podcast goes. I want to follow closely where the Rory and Mal podcast go after the fact. Okay, so now after saying that, let me say this. The new information that we got from Spaces, it was maybe a week or so ago. Joe Budden spoke on Rory and Mal again. Now, I remember both sides have said they're not going to speak on the other side. All right, they both said that. Both sides said, I'm done. We're no longer talking about the other side. We're not going to speak on the other side. Whatever. Now, that hasn't been the case. They've both spoke on each other multiple times. All right. So the last information that we got, the last reply that we, or let me not say reply, the last time we heard one of them speaking on the other, Joe Budden on Spaces, which Spaces is brilliant, by the way. The way that Joe Budden does that, the way that he has committed, he has people committed to making content about his show. That's a good idea. That's a good idea. And he actually took it a step further. He gets into Spaces and he talks, and that's what we about to listen to here. So this is, I don't know if somebody asked him, but he just started talking about the podcast. I'm pretty sure somebody asked him. Either way, the fact that he still speaks on the issues with Rory and Mal, I think that means that he knows he let something special go. Now, whether you want to blame Joe or not, do I blame Joe? It's blame on both sides. That's what I say. It's blame on both sides. However, I think the majority of the blame is on Joe. Joe is in control of everything. All right. And actually, let me just play this. Let me play this first, and we can go from there. So this is about 8 minutes long. This is Joe Budden in Spaces. Somebody asked him a question about the Rory and Mal podcast. This is what Joe had to say.
So imagine how I gotta feel handing you this type of coin, and I know that you don't even want to do this. You don't want to promote it. I had to force you here. Like, no.
Okay, he's talking about Rory and Mal not wanting to do Patreon. He had to force him to do Patreon. I'm just giving y'all some background on what they're talking about. I don't know if he'll get into it, but I'll explain why they didn't want to do the Patreon. But this is him saying he had to force him to do Patreon. They would show up and not want to do Patreon. They wouldn't post it.
Business wasn't going to continue to run that way. We had some talks, but I think that was too late by then. With regards to the $40,000 that you now said that Rory mentioned, he made it seem as if that was his monthly salary. I can't speak to anything that was said in that private meeting that I wasn't there for. I'll never know all the details from it. That whole I'll pay for production thing, maybe he did say that to them in that meeting while they were saying whatever they were saying. I have no idea. There's no way for me to ever know. As the that was paying for every month, nobody ever said to me, hey, I want to pay for something. The thing that's very different about this cast and that cast is this cast negotiates for the things that they want in their contract. I know Flip's antics during the year would make you think otherwise, but this cast, we stick to the contract. Whatever is in there is what's in there, so there's no room for the emotions. There's no room for none of the extra, no room for misinterpreting what the paper says. I think that's where I went wrong the first time. Like, I thought because y'all negotiated it, y'all knew what was in there, but their whole story is, they told us not to sign it, and we signed it, and he stole. Well, which one is it? Is it I stole, or did you sign something that you shouldn't have signed? It can't be all these different things. Well, they've been consistent in saying that, they had it in their contract. They could ask for the accounting whenever. And at some point, you stop providing it. This is what they said. You stop providing it to their likeness, and that it was in their contract that they could ask whenever they want. No, it was in the contract that you can ask for accounting whenever you want to ask for it, but that was the extent of your privileges. So you ask, and I give it to you. And that's the end.
All right, let me stop right there. Everybody, most people know this started with accounting, right? And you heard him say in the contract it said that they were able to ask for accounting. All right, they should be able to see accounting. That's normal. But he said you ask for accounting, I show it to you, and that's the end of it. That doesn't sound fair to me, especially if we're supposed to be friends. Remember, y'all, all the things that he's saying, these are his friends that he's talking about. Okay, these are people that he has a personal relationship with. These aren't people that he just hired off the street. These are not people who filled out an Indeed application. These are people not only that he has a personal relationship with, that he's known years before the podcast. Now, I don't know about Rory, but Maul specifically did not really want to do a podcast. I'm not going to say he didn't want to do it, but Joe reached out to him and was like, hey, can you be a part of my podcast? So, I mean, let's look at the dynamics there. You asked these guys to be on your podcast. We know he had two other hosts before when it first started. It was, I forgot the guy's name, but it was a guy and a girl. It was a completely different podcast. It was boring, in my opinion, before Rory and Ma came. The shit was boring to me. I listened to a couple of episodes. That's my opinion. The shit was boring until Rory and Ma came. So back to the accounting, which was that's where it started. The accounting, they wanted to see the accounting. He wouldn't let them. Finally, when he did, they weren't happy with the amount of money that they were getting versus what he was making. And I'm gonna break everything down once this is over. But to me, that sounds kind of shady. If I start a business with my friends and they want to see accounting and they have an issue, we're gonna sit down and talk about it. I'm not gonna say, I showed you the accounting, that's it. That's kind of fucked up.
Their problem was that wasn't the end for them. They had more questions, they had more thoughts. They were left to just come up with together on their own. But for me, I was being nice. And that's where the disconnect was. Like, they think I'm being, and I think I'm being nice. Like, in reality, any businessman that's running the business I run is supposed to put their car on the thingamajiggy, on How you travel? It's an expense.
Oh, okay. Yeah, explain it.
No, you shut up for a minute because you're a Rory Avenger too. That's an expense. Let's get.
Y'all see how he talked to people on his spaces, telling people to shut the fuck up. That's crazy, man. These are fans of Joe. These are fans of the Joe Budden podcast.
Let's have a learnable moment. I did not do that. Not a once. Some of the clothes, that's an expense. That's things that your normal accountant is going to tell you to do for your tax purposes at the end of the. I did not do that. You know how many things that just did not happen that should have happened? Like, right, to be fighting with some that you're doing this for? Like, no. No, it was disrespect at the highest level. And then you use the airwaves to rebel. Like, now I feel like you slapping me in the face, you slapping the fans in the face. I don't know what's going on.
They say they were never paid from the YouTube.
They weren't paid from YouTube.
How is that possible? Because the podcast, like, is that not considered podcast, or is that just the spot of?
No, that's not considered nothing. That's Joe Budden back when YouTube was an afterthought, like not even a thought. When nobody cared about YouTube, when you couldn't post things longer than 90 seconds and 3 minutes on YouTube, that was Joe Budden there building a YouTube. So when you...
Okay, I got to stop it one more time. That's not right, in my opinion. I guess if it's in the contract, he can do whatever he wants to. But to not give them any YouTube money, that's kind of fucked up. Listen, man, I get what he's saying. I started YouTube years ago. I started a YouTube early. I started a YouTube way before I started a Joe Budden podcast. The YouTube has been around for 15, 16 years, however the case may be. Cool. But listen, if you go to his YouTube and look at the videos before the Joe Budden podcast with Rory and Mal, it was the numbers are drastically different. His YouTube was not on fire when it was just Joe Budden. Let's be real. The majority of the revenue from YouTube came from the Joe Budden podcast with Rory and Mal. That's where you got 100, 200, 300, 400, 500,000 view videos was the Joe Budden podcast with Rory and Mal.
So when you come to me and say, hey, I want some of your YouTube, I'm going to say, no, that's a hard line. That's a hard line. There is no room for discussion in terms of this. If you want to continue to discuss this, then you can work elsewhere. You'll never be entitled to one red cent from my YouTube. Paul would never get one red cent from my YouTube. Hey, let's get back to the courtesy.
You see how he's calling it my YouTube, but which is true. It is his YouTube, but the most valuable videos and the content that's bringing the most money is the Joe Budden podcast with Rory and Mal.
See, like I said then, and you'll never find another earth to say this. Hey, all of this footage that I'm paying for that's mine, I'll give it to you and you go build yours. I said that out my mouth. I said that to a friend out of my mouth. They took it as a slight. It's the same thinking. I don't stop Danny from posting clips. There's mad bootleggers that I don't stop from posting clips. The more clips, the better. If the most popular members from the show go and start their own YouTube, YouTube is as big as the world. The more, the better. Rory, take the same clips. You go start a page. You go start a page. Everybody go do their thing. You monetize your own.
Okay, now that sounds good, but let's be clear. He said, I'm going to give y'all clips that I use and y'all can start a YouTube with these clips. It sounds good, but he still controls the clips that he's giving y'all, so he can decide what clips to give you and what not, and what clips to not give you. Okay, so he's still controlling everything. He's not giving them a piece of the large pie, which I understand if that's his contract. If they sign a fucked up contract, that's on them. But again, I reiterate, if when it's your friends, you should be willing to work with them and at least meet them halfway. All right. For them to jump in this and not have no IP, they're already meeting you halfway. Because they know once this is over, we not gonna own nothing. If we were to break up like they did, we not gonna own nothing. You gonna have everything. So them even agreeing to that is them meeting you halfway, bro. I feel you should have been willing to do the same.
See what this takes. See how much it costs. See the work that goes into it. Don't just come with a handout begging. Again, you have to establish these things before you put them on a paper so the paper reflects it. A lot of it, I know that it's provocative and juicy, but a lot of this stuff is put to bed just with what you decide to put on the paper. There's there that just can't be argued about or debated, or you could be emotional about it or mad about it, but it's misplaced anger. It's misplaced anger. It would be like me beefing with Webb and Nitty because of the contract that I signed in 2001. It was a lot of stuff in that contract, y'all. Like it was in hindsight, I feel like I shouldn't have signed it, but I did sign it, and it granted me the opportunity to go on and do everything that I ended up doing. And I love both of them today. Those are my guys, because they didn't have to do none of that, and they did what you're supposed to do on that side of the table.
All right, I gotta stop it one more time. Okay, he signed to Webb and Nitty. Webb and Nitty, two street guys from Queens. They put Joe in a bad contract. He talks about how bad this contract is all the time. And I'll tell you this, I'm willing to bet the reason that contract bothers Joe Budden so much now, looking back, is because they were his friends. They were his associates. All right. They were people who he knew from the streets. So that's why he feels slighted, because if it was just a regular businessman or a regular record company, you would expect them to put you in a fucked up contract. Whether you signed it or not would be up to you. But that would be something that you would expect. You don't expect your friends to put you in a messed up contract. That's just not something that you expect from people who you have a personal relationship with.
All that emotional business is over with for that. It's over with for that.
Wait. So, Joe, why did you ever decide to do a profit split with them in the beginning? Why wasn't over salaries from the start?
Because it's a courtesy. You want to allow people to grow with the growth. Again, I said we betting on us. So, yeah, if this thing gets this big, you should grow with that. I don't feel like the people that contributed should be locked in to any fee, because it assumes you're going to work. You did the work. You're going to work.
But are you currently involved in any litigation from the Rory and Maul situation?
Not at all. Why would I be?
Just asking, because it seems
there is no stop. That's more from the Rory Ventures on this side. Glad I'm here.
I'm not a Rory Venture. I'm just saying.
But it's fine. If it don't apply, let it fly. The point is, there is no room for anything to be litigated. There's no room. Like, the contract is what it is, very clear. There's no court case coming. It's not all I'm standing on business, so I'm not suing. I've never been audited. You cannot continue to say that this is a thief and you've never audited. That means that you're going off my numbers and my paperwork. I hand it over when you ask for accounting. So do you trust the accounting or not? It gets tricky. And because a lot of y'all don't know what the niggas be talking about, let's get off lives. Nah, we here today.
All right, so yeah, that's that. And now that was a couple of days ago. Joe is still, this is still unsettling for him. I can tell. Joe is still unsettled by this. He's unsettled with the fact that people see him a certain way. And, you know, people call Joe semantics man for a reason. He uses words a certain way. I'm not going to say he's a liar, but he says things a certain way. Like, I'll give you an example. On the Breakfast Club interview, when he addressed, this was years ago, he addressed his fight with Tahiri. All right. Tahiri said, I think it was Tahiri. I'm not one of his exes. I think it was Tahiri though. One of his exes said when they were fighting, she was pregnant. Joe hit her. He pinned her to the ground and he sat on her stomach while she was pregnant. That's what she said. She said, Joe pinned me to the ground and he sat on my stomach. When Joe went to the Breakfast Club interview, Joe said, that's a lie. I didn't sit on her stomach. I sat under her breast, beneath her breast. Now, I'm not a super ladies man. I'm not no type of Rico Suave, but I've seen a few breasts in my day. There was always a stomach underneath them. Okay, so for him to say, I didn't sit on her stomach, I sat under her breast, well, that's the same thing. But sitting on her stomach sounds worse. So he said, I sat under her breast. What's under a woman's breast? A stomach. So that's just an example of how he uses words, how he changes words around to fit his narrative. I don't know the particulars of the contract, but what I do know is Joe Budden, he like what he said about the clips. I will give y'all the clips. Y'all can use, y'all can repost it. He didn't say what clips. He didn't say how often he would give them clips. When you're dealing with somebody like that, and who has a history of being a semantic person, it's easy to not accept things from them because you never know when they're being upfront and honest. You never know when they're really saying what they mean. He uses this to his advantage as an entertainer. And it's good as a podcaster for your audience. But when you talk this way to your inner circle, to your family, to your girlfriend, to your boyfriend, to your mom, dad, sister, brother, people around you, it's not right. And it makes people not trust you. It makes people not trust you. Again, I'm not trying to throw any dirt on Joe or criticize Joe from this. I'm just going off of what he said and the facts. So we're going to do a little rundown with Copilot to see if we can get a little bit deeper into this. We're going to see how to start it and where it's going. So let's ask Copilot, why did Rory and Mal leave the Joe Budden podcast?
Rory Farrell and Jamil Mel Clay left the Joe Budden podcast due to a breakdown in communication and disagreements. The specifics weren't fully aired on the podcast, but it appears that equity and pay were major issues. Rory and Mel believed they were equal contributors to the show's success, and there were tensions around ownership and financial matters. Joe Budden later apologized for publicly firing them and acknowledged the need for better communication. If you're interested, there are videos where Joe discusses the situation in more detail.
Okay, so it was money, okay? Equity and pay were major issues. Rory and Mal believed they were equal contributors to the show's success, and there were tensions around ownership and financial matters. That was the foundation of it. That was the source of it. If you listen to Ish, right, from the current show, He said multiple times, make accounting public. He said, post it online, show people the accounting, show people how much money you made. Now, they may have signed a messed up contract, but the point is this. I feel Joe Budden was not expecting to make as much money as he did. When he brought Rory and Mal on, he felt like it was just going to be a regular podcast. He knew it was going to be successful, but I'm sure he thought it would take several more years to get a multi-million-dollar deal. It didn't. It happened pretty quick. It happened pretty quick. They got a multi-million-dollar deal from Cash App pretty quick. I heard on one of the spaces, they was giving Joe Budden $1 million per quarter. Cash App was giving Joe Budden $1 million per quarter. Y'all remember during the Joe Budden podcast with Rory and Mob, they had the little Cash App watermark on the screen the whole time. The whole time. So Cash App was giving him $1 million per quarter. The reason Joe doesn't want to show accounting, he doesn't want to make it public, is because it's going to show how many millions of dollars that he made. And he didn't want to, he wanted to keep their pay the same. Although the revenue that the show was bringing in was far more than he expected. It was more than he expected. And I don't think he felt like Rory and Mal deserved that much money. But they helped him make it. So I want to ask y'all, this is a strategic thinking media platform. If you start a podcast with your friends, you and your two best friends start a podcast, and you say, okay, we'll start making 6 figures, 7 figures in 12 to 18 months. And y'all reach that number in 6 months. Now, they're signed to make a certain amount, but y'all exceed expectations way more than what y'all thought. Do you give them extra money? Do you give them a raise? Or do you say, well, y'all signed a contract for this amount, so this is the amount that y'all are gonna take? Let me know. How do y'all feel about that? Now, let's ask Copilot this. How did fans react to Rory and Mal's departure?
Fans had mixed reactions to Rory and Mal's departure from the Joe Budden podcast. Some were disappointed and expressed their loyalty to the original trio, while others understood the need for change and supported Joe Budden's decision to continue the show with new co-hosts. Social media buzzed with memes, jokes, and speculation about the future of the podcast. Overall, it was a significant moment in hip-hop podcast culture, and fans eagerly awaited updates and explanations from all parties involved.
And we got that to an extent, but as you can see, they're still going back and forth. So it's not completely finished. There's still explanations that need to be had. There's still things that the public want to see. I would like to see accounting. I would like to see how much Joe Budden how much he made. And I feel the reason that he won't release that is because it was a lot of money. And when we see the number, when we see the amount, we're going to say, damn, bro, you could have broke them off. You could have broke them off. We get it, man. They signed a contract. But to not give them no YouTube money, like, bro, you basically saying they're not the reason for your YouTube being financially successful, or they have nothing to do with your YouTube being financially successful. I get it. The clips, I'll give them the clips and they can use the clips however they want. Man, I don't know. I don't agree with that. I don't agree with that. Now, I just don't agree with that. Would that help them to have, take the clips and start their own YouTubes? Yeah, of course. It would have put money in their pocket. They would have made extra money that way. But they feel like they were a very important part of the current YouTube. Joe, but let's see. Let's see how many subscribers the Joe Budden podcast has. Joe Budden TV, the Joe Budden Network has 1.42 million subscribers. All right, so he's on his way to 2 million subscribers in the next 6 to 8 months. That's a lot of money. That's a lot of revenue. Let's take a look at his numbers. The latest episode that dropped, I don't want to start playing it. The latest episode that dropped 3 days ago has 322,000 views. The loyal listenership that is part of the Joe Budden podcast, it started with Rory and Mal. Of these 322,000 views, how many of y'all do y'all think of those 322,000 views? How many of those people do y'all think just started watching the Joe Budden podcast with Ice, Ish, Melissa Ford, and Queens Flip? What percentage would y'all say? I would probably say 10 to 15%. 10 to 15%. The other 85 to 90% was here during Rory and Mal's run. Does that mean that Joe has to give them the YouTube money? No, because you get what you sign, and he spoke on that. He said the new cast, which he's talking about those people right there that you see, Queens Flip, Melissa Ford, Ice, and Ish, he said they negotiate what they want. Yes, Joe, because they see you fuck over Rory and Mal. That's why they're so sharp when it comes to negotiating with you, because they seen you fuck over other people. That's why. That's why they negotiate everything. Does that make sense to that? That's what I'm getting from it. That's what I'm getting from it. And for Joe Budden to talk about honoring a contract during his everyday struggle, I'm pretty sure he broke that contract. And during his everyday struggle days, he came right out and said it. I don't honor contracts. If I sign a contract and I feel like you're trying to get over on me, it's fuck the contract. But when you're the one writing the contracts, you feel everybody should stick it out. I don't know how I feel about that. But let's go back, or no, before we go back to Copilot, let's look at the Rory and Mal podcast. Rory and Mal have 273,000 subscribers. Newest episode has 20,000 views in 12 hours. Now, while these numbers aren't low, to me, I feel like they deserve a bigger look than this, based on the podcast that they were a part of before. They deserve a bigger look than this. Now, a lot of people feel like the quality of the podcast isn't there, which is cool. That's something they have to work on. But I also think that their podcast is different from Joe's. I think, and this is something that hurt them. This is another thing that hurt them. When they left, the Joe Budden podcast, people were looking for this to be like a Joe Budden podcast spinoff. That's not what it is. That's not what it is. It's never going to be that. Just like how Joe Budden's podcast is never going to be that. He has more people. He has more going on. He has more yelling. He has more dancing. But it's not the same. And because Rory and Mal were the ones who had to remove themselves and start from scratch, it puts them in a tough position. It puts them in a tough position. The majority of the fans who rocked with the Joe Budden podcast with Rory and Mal, they want the screaming, they want the yelling. And like I say, that's putting them in a tough situation because the Joe Budden podcast with Rory and Mal was so balanced. It had everything. You had Joe for the screaming and yelling. You had Mal, the cool guy, relaxed, laid back dude. And you had Rory, who was like in between. The podcast was perfect. That balance hasn't returned to either platform. And I don't know if it ever will. I even heard a rumor, I don't know if this is true on Spaces, that Rory might return to the Joe Budden podcast. I don't believe that. But I will say this. Rory and Joe haven't really went as far as Mal and Joe did. I don't think Mal and Joe could ever be friends again. The things that they said about each other, I don't know if you could ever take that back. Even if you do, I don't know how the chemistry would be on a podcast after you said the type of things that they said about each other. So I don't know if that's true. Either way. And I also heard that Joe Budden is actively trying to break up that podcast. I don't know how, and I don't even know if that's true. People are saying they're at odds. I don't know how, and I don't know why. And I don't know. To me, it looks like their work ethic is there. And Joe talks about in the clip that I played previously, and I have another clip to play. I'll probably get to part 2 of this tomorrow. In the clip that I played that y'all heard, Joe Budden says they didn't want to do the work. They didn't want to do the work. How did the podcast get as big as it got? If they didn't, so one day they just decided to stop working. Something's not right about that. You did something to cause that attitude. Like I said, man, they went into it owning nothing, with no IP, with no ownership. If I start a business, and I have 2 friends who do that, they're basically relinquishing all the power to you. From the jump, they're basically saying, hey, this is your ship. We're just riding along. Yeah, bro, it would be good to throw them a little something extra here and there because of that situation. Because look what happened. And it's unfortunate, man, but that's just something that I wanted to touch on. That clip specifically that we heard, I wanted to talk about that because I don't feel like Joe Budden is over this. This is not over. I feel like they're going to reply back to him if they haven't already. But what I think I'm going to do, like I spoke from the beginning of the show, what I think I'm going to do, I'll probably, depending on the price, I'll probably start up a Patreon for both of them. Join their Patreons and see a little bit more behind the scenes, because I feel like I can give y'all more information about the podcast, knowing and being a consumer of the Patreon content. Because I don't think this is over, man. I feel like I say, a lot of unanswered questions. And for Joe to still, and see, Joe won't talk about this on the podcast. Not that I've heard. Maybe he talks about it on Patreon. I don't know. But he talks about it on Spaces. And I like how Danny was asking him the real questions. Danny was asking him the real questions, man. And he even he had a video about Ish basically agreeing, saying, show the accounting. And Joe says what? I'm so offended that you think I'm stealing, I'm not going to show it. That's a mental trick. That's a social experiment. That's a way to not to be a victim when after you victimize people. Why not just show it if you have nothing to hide? But we'll probably get into the part 2 tomorrow. I just really wanted to go over that clip. I didn't mean to just go so far back, but I wanted to go over that clip because I think it's important that we're here in 2024. Joe Budden is still explaining himself. Again, his what he's doing on Spaces is great. I think every podcast should do that. Every podcast should have a core group of people who create content about their podcast. That's a great idea. Him coming into the Spaces and talking about it is an even better idea. That adds a lot to it. But why are you in there answering questions about Rory and Mal still? Is it guilt? I don't know, man. Y'all get in the comments to let me know, man. This is Urban Artificial Intelligence Strategic Thinking Media Platform. I appreciate y'all watching. And I'll probably be back with another episode about this. This is just interesting to me, man. I was such a big fan of the original podcast that I'm not just like gonna let this go. You know what I'm saying? And by I'm not gonna let this go, I mean when one or the other speak on it, then we got to talk about it, because clearly they're talking about it. They're not over it. You know what I'm saying? So we'll see what happens, man. Glad y'all stuck around for this. Didn't want to be long-winded and talk too long. Just wanted to speak on that quick clip. Urban Artificial Intelligence. Thank y'all for listening. I'm going to see y'all in the next episode.